Hey everybody, this is Professor Champy coming to you once again. Today I have more of a mailbag episode, hoping to answer some of your questions about the poetry essay and maybe give some advice on writing this. Um, I think I received maybe 6 questions from you guys. I would have liked to see a little bit more. So let's make sure that we're still keeping up with Canvas and handing everything in, looking out for the journals and everything like that. I am going to be grading this stuff, so you want to make sure you have everything in. Okay, so let's move to the first question now. So one question I got, I guess I'm going to leave these anonymous. I guess that's a better way to do this. But I do want to show you some of the actual questions I got. So first question. I'm having difficulty choosing a poem, and how can I connect the poem to question number 2 on the poetry essay assignment sheet? Okay, this is a good question. I'm sure a lot of you are still in that beginning stage of trying to pick a poem and get started with this. We did have the rough draft due on Monday, so make sure you get something submitted there if you haven't done so yet. I'm still going to take a look at those. So, how should we pick a poem? The first thing I would say, like I think I said about the short stories, and I would always kind of tell you, is start with what you're interested in. If there's any of the poems that you just like, or you think is cool, or sticks out to you in a way that the other ones don't, it's always fun to try to make that work if you can. If that's not the case, if none of them are particularly interesting to you, I would just try to go with the one that you think you have the most to say about, that you can put into an argument the easiest, and that you think will make it the easiest for you to get, 4 pages out of. So the second question from the poetry essay assignment sheet had to do with race and belonging. I think I was asking what the poems are saying about the feeling of belonging in America. When you look at the history of racism, like we have in that historical info in the long civil rights movement essay, what do the poems think about belonging given these circumstances? So some of the things that I would look at there have to do with maybe the emotional stakes of being a black person in America that some of the poems touch on, especially Citizen, which I think is really focused on more of a psychological level. I know one of the poems in Citizen mentions the term they use, John Henryism, which they say is the term for the psychological effects that racism has on people, how it can kind of be draining and just have like emotional consequences for people besides the obvious societal consequences. So that's one way to think about it. Some other ways is I think of Mississippi Goddamn, where I think there's a line where Nina Simone says, "I don't belong here, I don't belong there. I've even stopped believing in prayer." I think is the next part. But I don't belong here, I don't belong there. That feeling of where am I supposed to be, of being like without a country, right? When we looked at the historical info and the resistance to granting African American citizenship in America, so it's like, what does that do to a person, so I think Nina Simone is definitely exploring that a little bit in Mississippi Goddamn, about not belonging, about not necessarily, you don't have to live next to me. That whole kind of thing, I think, is one take on that. I think We Shall Overcome gives us maybe the opposite take of walking hand in hand, and how, uh, that to move forward to get equality, it has to be more about feeling like you belong in that way. I don't know. It's confusing. Maybe We Shall Overcome is more, I don't know, was a positive look, or trying to see like what the benefits would be if we could get to a place where everyone felt like they belonged. So I think those are some of the things I would be thinking about with that question. Okay, let's move on to another question I got here. Somebody else wrote, "What's difficult for me about the poetry is that I really don't get the story like some parts. It's pretty hard for me because I hate poetry. Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard, but I do understand some of it, like how they explain what happens in our everyday life. Something we can relate to, at least most of us can relate to." Um, so I think I see what you're getting at here. So, like we've talked about, poetry definitely is difficult. Our usual response to poetry is just to be like, I don't get it, I don't understand, I don't know what they're talking about. They're all over the place, and I understand why we go to that. So I think my advice on dealing with just how confusing these poems are would be to start just with noticing things. Well, obviously watch the videos and the notes that I put up, and hopefully they'll at least get you started thinking about some of the stuff here. But you just want to start with noticing things. You want to start with repetition, things that stink out, what seems important when you look at the poem a couple of times. Once you start noticing things, you want to ask, why might the author be doing this? And I know I'm not trying to make us get in the author's head. That's not how I like to do it. But what you could think, what effect does it have on the audience that they're doing this thing, that they're repeating this word so much? Like we looked at dream, how the word dream gets repeated in Harlem and Kitchenette Building. So in terms of how these poems relate to everyday life, um, I the way I've kind of been framing it is to look at how they fit into very specific arguments that were happening within the civil rights movement, to certain political ideologies of the time period. So I think if we're looking how it connects to everyday life, it's kind of like what do the poems think need to be done within the time period? What political like ideas were the poems trying to get out there? I think that's maybe the most basic way to think about making an argument here. What is the political message of the poems? What do they think needs to be done? What do they think the goal of the movement should be? How do they think what's the best way to achieve those goals? How do these poems fit in with Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, maybe, as well as other thinkers from the time period? I think these are all ways to kind of connect it to the everyday life and to look at the messages that they're trying to send. So I understand these poems being confusing, but hopefully once we look at it within the context of these kind of political arguments, we can start to see what exactly these poems are trying to say to us. All right, moving on to the third question here. Question number 3. These poems are very interesting, so I don't think there was a problem understanding them and having to explain them. The only thing that's hard is we're not in class physically, so it's harder to understand exactly what we're supposed to argue, because in class we usually talk about it more in depth, but I think my arm's on the right path for what we're supposed to do. Yes, I share difficulties of not being in class. I really feel like me in class versus me on video is kind of like if there's you ever seen like a pretty good stand-up comedian, like a decent stand-up comedian who then tries to make a movie and it's just like awful. I feel like that's me on video here. So I definitely feel the pain of not being in class physically. I do wish we're there. It's a lot easier for me, and honestly, more work for me this way. It's tough. I'm sure it's a lot of work for you guys too. So I feel your pain with that. But the thing that I want to emphasize is I think to kind of get some of that, we do need to try to be more conversational in our discussion threads. I want to see you guys responding to each other more or responding to me. I know sometimes I post a little bit late, but if you do see that I responded to one of your things, maybe respond to what I said, and then we can kind of get some of that back and forth going. Also, send me some questions, and maybe I can answer them in videos, or obviously I can email you back and things like that. In terms of what we're supposed to argue, so obviously I would go to the assignment sheet to try to get clear on that, the suggested topics I have up there. But to me, the first one is maybe the easiest one, or the one that the poems have the most to say about, where I think I'm asking you, what are these poems trying to say about revolution or resistance? What do these poems think needs to be done to try to achieve equality? What is the vision of the civil rights movement that these poems have? So, so maybe the easiest way to think about this is, first of all, do you see the poems as more on the kind of peaceful protesting side, the Martin Luther King kind of Christian, marches and sit-ins movement, or do you see these poems as being more on the black nationalist side, more close to the ideas that Malcolm X explained, the message to the grassroots? Um, Are they calling for total dismantle of the system, or are they calling for more integration? Um, do the poems think that we need to forgive our enemies and turn the other cheek and everything like that, or do they think that you need to get out in the streets and kind of do whatever you have to do to get equality? So I would try to start looking to form an argument. I would try to start looking at what you think the politics of the poems are. How do they fit in with the political ideas of the time period? Um, how would you connect them to some of the political stuff that we've been reading in essays? But ultimately, you can argue whatever you want as long as you're trying to convince us of a message you think the text is sending. As long as you're telling us, the text is trying to say this on whatever topic, you can really make any argument you want. Those are, of course, just my suggestions, and I think the most straightforward way to look at it. But yeah, I'm open to any argument you guys want to make. So let's keep it moving on to question number 4 here. Question 4, I have. So I started working on the poetry essay this morning. The only real issue is distractions. Like I know where I want to go with the essay. I'm thinking about writing about the impact of poetry once you truly understand what it's really about. I wanted to use the poem Harlem and Kitchenette Building to explain how poems can have important historical meaning. So, first of all, this question mentions distractions. Um, I know motivation and procrastination are always issues in every semester of school, for me and for students. But it's probably magnified even more so during this time of us all being stuck at home. I'm sure you're getting bothered by your parents and siblings and whoever you have to live with, roommates. So distractions can definitely be a problem here. It's definitely been a problem for me. So I'm trying to work through it. The things that I always recommend for distractions, so I think it's the same things as normal, but we just have to try even harder. The things that I normally recommend in terms of motivation are number one, making lists. I've been doing this every morning, especially during the quarantine, of when I get up in the morning, kind of, getting some coffee, sitting down, and marking out a list of what I need to do for the day. Whether it's laundry or going to the grocery store, or it's making a video like I'm doing now, or doing some homework, or starting on your essay, or whatever it is. I think it's really important from the top of your day just to get a list going. I know it's corny and it seems stupid, but it really does help. It really keeps you on track. Because then, when you inevitably find yourself just kind of sitting there looking at the ceiling, you can look back at your list and be like, okay, this is exactly where I want it to be. And then you get the added benefit of crossing things off your list, which becomes excellent. The next thing is schedules, planning out how much time you're going to do something. Are you going to do homework for an hour or are you going to do it for 2 hours? Kind of setting these limits, I think, makes it easier for us to deal with it. If you just kind of start studying and you're going to do it indefinitely, it can just feel like a slog, and you can, you start looking at websites or whatever, getting distracted from there. So I think setting schedules for time periods, taking breaks, but saying, I'm going to take a 15-minute break now and then I'll get back to it instead of just like stopping completely. I think those are really important. Also, calendars, keeping track of when your stuff is due, how much time you really have to hand things in. You really got to stay on top of this stuff, especially when it's not in class, so I can't remind you constantly. I'll try to do the best I can with the instructions and everything like that and emails. But you really got to mark out when things are due and plan when you're going to do work on certain things. And I know all our lives are crazy right now, so it's hard to do. But yeah, lists, schedules, calendars are all helpful in terms of stuff. I think also just keeping in mind, like, things have gone totally crazy this semester. So I would say for most of your classes, as long as you're putting in some effort, handing things in, and like just trying and like clearly trying, professors are probably going to take it pretty easy on you. So I would try to keep that in the back of your head. That really the only way you can do poorly this semester is just to not hand things in for this class and all your other classes. As long as you're making an effort, I think teachers are going to be willing to work with you a lot. So keep that as motivation as well. So the other part of this question, they mentioned wanting to write about the impact of poetry or how it can have historical meaning, and I think that's true, but I would be careful about having a thesis that said something like that, just because I am not totally sure what you mean by historical meaning. I'm not totally sure what you mean by historical meaning or the importance of seeing what the poem is about. You want to be as specific as you can with your thesis. What message is the poem sending? What is it trying to show us? Like, yes, I do think that poetry obviously can have historical meaning and can be impactful for sure. But that's kind of a meta sort of essay, just like about poetry itself. I would focus more on here's exactly what these poems are saying. Here's, the political ideologies that they're trying to get across, or here's what they thought people should do during the time period, or here's what they think about race in America and, what it means to be an African American, and things like that. So I would just try to be more argument focused, thesis focused, and make sure that you're showing us what the messages of one or more of the poems are. Moving right along to question number 5. For question 5, we have I don't really have many questions on the poetry essay and feel comfortable going into it. I do feel like it might be a bit difficult to write 5-page essay on a small poem, but I'll probably just use the poems as support for my argument. I actually am probably going to tweak topic 2 a bit and talk about things that have gotten a lot better because of the movement. Okay, so first of all, obviously for any essay we're writing, how long it is can be an issue if we don't have enough to say. So I think we talked a lot in class about the importance of a thesis and having a thesis that's general enough that you can write 4 pages about it, but specific enough that you can make a clear and convincing argument, right? We do need to find that sweet spot in terms of our thesis to make sure that we can get to those 4 pages, but do a good job on the argument that we have in 4 pages. So, a couple other things that this question touches on, the idea of the poems just being support for the argument, that I don't think is a good idea. This is still a literary analysis essay, so your argument does need to be grounded in the poems. Um, the poems, are going to tell us something about politics or about race or something like that, but your essay isn't just about politics or race. Your essay is about what the poems are trying to tell us and why these poems are important, and the kind of philosophies that they're trying to get out there. So you really want to make sure that your thesis is grounded in the poems. So I wouldn't think of the poems just as support for your argument. In terms of the idea of things having gotten a lot better, obviously that's true in certain ways, but not every way. So I would be careful here. Like, which of the poems tell us that things have gotten a lot better? The only modern, or really modern, really recent poem that we had was Citizen. And that poem, I think, is kind of about the problems that we still have, not necessarily saying that things have gotten better. Yes, those poems are more about like kind of the psychological trauma around racism in America, and they're not about people getting beaten or anything like that. So you can say that that's progress, but that's precious little progress. And even if Citizen is mostly about psychological stuff, like I said in my notes about this, I think in the background of Citizen is kind of the specter of police brutality. In terms of how they have the hoodie on the cover of the book that I posted in one of the discussion threads. Take a look at that if you haven't seen it. It's a really nice cover. But connecting to kind of things like Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and these people of color who have been killed by police. So I wonder which of the poems that we've looked at kind of show us that things like have gotten better, definitely a lot better. I would make sure that we're focusing on the poems and not just trying to make our own general historical argument. That's more of a history paper, right? I want to make sure we're writing a literary analysis paper and looking at what the poems are trying to tell us. Okay, now for the final question that I have for today. Okay, so here's this question. In my essay, I'm trying to show how racism has become less overt over the years through the poem Citizen of Mississippi Goddamn. As a result, my first thought was to compare and analyze the content of both poems along with outside sources. However, that would mean that analysis of the actual techniques used by the poems would be made secondary, which I don't think is what you're looking for. Currently, I'm trying to incorporate more analysis on the techniques used by both poems to emphasize what aspects of racism we considered more pressing at the time both were written, but I'm having trouble balancing between the content of the poem and techniques used. As a result, my question is, should my essay focus on my analysis of the techniques used by both poems to get their message across, or the analysis of the actual content of both poems? Okay, this is a really good question. I like the way that we're thinking. I'm very glad that we're thinking about kind of like form and content as the two ways that we go about analyzing poetry. That's definitely a good sign and something that I want us to be thinking about. The question of should one be more than the other, I think it's more of a both approach. Ultimately, what we're doing is trying to make an argument about the message of the poem, right? So in order to do that, we're going to look both at the actual words that are used, the content of the poem, the message of that we get through the meaning of the words. But we should also look at the structure of the poem and the form of it and the techniques used. But ultimately, we're looking at how both of those contribute to the one message that we see the poem sending. So I would see those more as like two different pieces of evidence that we have. The actual words in the poem, the content, and the way that it's written, the form of the poem, and I would use both of those as evidence for the one message that you think it's sending. So I don't think there's really an either or answer there. I would definitely be looking at both of them and seeing how both of them fit into your thesis, fit into the argument that you're ultimately trying to make about the poems. So I think this last question gets me to just my final couple of things that I would want to emphasize for you here. The first one being the message, right? That this is still a literary analysis essay. It's still the same kind of essay as we did for the short stories, even though we're dealing with poetry. So first and foremost, you want to make sure you're making an argument about the message that you think the poem is sending. Other things that I would emphasize, quotations, just like we did before, introduce quotes, explain quotes, Make sure that you're doing all the formatting stuff. The name of the poem should go in quotation marks, stuff like that. And yeah, I am going to be posting your grades for the short story essay in the next couple of days, so take a look at those. And make sure you read my comments so you can apply whatever I said on there to this essay as well. And I think that's all that I have for you now. Just remember all the things about writing literary analysis papers that we talked about with the last one. Let me know if you have any other questions, and I'll talk to you next time, and I'll see you in the discussion threads. Take care.